Elena felt the damp chill of the old house seep into her bones. It was a familiar cold, one that had settled in the stone walls long ago and never truly left, not even in the height of summer. Now, in the autumn of her life, it seemed to cling to her more insistently, a constant companion to the rattle in her chest. She pulled her thin, frayed shawl tighter around her shoulders, the wool worn almost to the thread. Her hands, resting in her lap, were a testament to her 70 years. They were not the soft, delicate hands of a woman who had been cared for. They were a road map of her life, with knuckles swollen like river stones and skin cracked like dry earth. These hands had scrubbed floors, washed clothes for wealthy families, kneaded dough, and tended a small garden that fed her son for 2 decades. They had worked tirelessly, endlessly, for him. Her gaze drifted to the small, faded photograph on the mantelpiece. It showed a younger Elena, her face full and smiling, standing beside her husband, Antonio. He was a strong man, with kind eyes and a laugh that used to make the window panes tremble. In front of them stood a small boy with dark, serious eyes and a mop of unruly hair. That boy was Marco. Her Marco. A wave of love, so powerful it was almost painful, washed over her. She remembered the warmth of his small hand in hers, the weight of him sleeping on her chest, the fierce, protective surge she felt every time she looked at him. Antonio had been gone for 20 years, but Marco was her sun, her moon, her entire world. A hacking cough seized her, a dry barking sound that shook her frail frame. She pressed a hand to her chest, waiting for the spasm to pass. She had been sick for weeks, a persistent fever and a cough that left her breathless. She had tried to call Marco, to tell him she was unwell, but her calls had gone unanswered. He was a busy man, she told herself, an important man. He had a big company, a beautiful wife, a life that was a universe away from this small, crumbling house at the edge of town. She did not want to be a burden. She never wanted to be a burden. The sound of a car engine, sleek and powerful, sliced through the quiet afternoon. It was a sound that did not belong here, on this unpaved road, where only old trucks and bicycles ever ventured. Elena shuffled to the window, her worn slippers whispering against the cold floorboards. A gleaming black car, polished to a mirror shine, was parked in front of her gate. Marco stepped out from the driver's side. He wore a suit so sharp it looked like it could cut glass, and his shoes reflected the gray sky. Beside him, his wife, Isabella, emerged, her expression a mask of distaste as her expensive heels sank slightly into the muddy gravel. Elena's heart leaped with a desperate, foolish hope. He had come. He had gotten her messages. He had come to see his sick mother. She hurried to the door, her aches and pains momentarily forgotten, a weak smile forming on her lips. She fumbled with the old lock, her trembling fingers struggling with the familiar mechanism. Finally, the door creaked open. "Marco," she breathed, her voice raspy. He did not smile. His face was a closed door, his eyes cold and distant. He did not step forward to hug her. He did not ask how she was feeling. He looked past her, into the dim interior of the house, his gaze sweeping over the faded wallpaper and the worn furniture with a clinical detachment. "Mother," he said, his voice flat. "We need to talk." Isabella remained a few steps behind him, her arms crossed, a shield of expensive fabric and perfume against the poverty that seemed to radiate from the very walls of the house. She did not greet Elena. She simply watched, her eyes narrowed, as if observing an unpleasant business transaction. Elena stepped back, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. This was not the visit she had prayed for. This was not her son coming to care for her. This was a stranger wearing her son's face. She led them into the small living room, the one room she kept tidy for a visit that never came. She gestured to the old armchair, its fabric worn through in patches. "Sit, please," she whispered. "Can I make you some coffee?" "There's no time for that," Marco said, remaining standing. He paced the small room, his expensive shoes looking absurd against the threadbare rug. He stopped in front of the fireplace and ran a finger along the dusty mantelpiece, then wiped it on his trousers with a look of faint disgust. "I'll be direct," he began, turning to face her. "I've sold the house." The words hung in the air, heavy and unreal. Elena stared at him, her mind refusing to understand. Sold the house? This house? The house where she was born, where she had married Antonio, where she had raised Marco? The house that held every memory she possessed? It was impossible. It was a cruel joke. What are you saying?" she stammered, sinking onto the edge of the sofa. The springs groaned in protest. "It's a business decision," Marco said, his tone devoid of any emotion. "The land this house is on has become very valuable. My partners and I are developing the area. This little plot is essential. The deal is done. The new owners will be here in 2 days to demolish it." Demolish it. The word was a physical blow. Elena felt the air leave her lungs. She looked around the room, at the crack in the ceiling that was shaped like a bird, at the spot on the floor where Marco had spilled ink as a boy, a stain she could never quite remove. Her whole life was contained within these 4 walls. "But where will I go?" she asked, her voice a fragile thread. "I've made arrangements," he said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "There is a place, a state-run facility for the elderly. It's clean. They will provide you with meals. It's for the best. You're not well. You can't look after yourself anymore." He said the words as if he were discussing a logistical problem, an inconvenient piece of inventory that needed to be moved from one warehouse to another. There was no trace of compassion, no hint of sorrow. Isabella finally spoke, her voice sharp and brittle. "It's a very practical solution, Marco. Your mother will be much more comfortable there. This place is simply not hygienic." Elena looked from her son's cold face to her daughter-in-law's disdainful one. She felt a wave of dizziness. As they spoke of her future in a sterile, loveless institution, her mind flashed back to another time, another sacrifice. She saw herself, 30 years younger, standing in a dusty pawn shop. She was twisting her wedding ring off her finger, the simple gold band that Antonio had placed there with a promise of forever. Marco had been accepted into a prestigious university, an opportunity that could change his life, but they had no money for the tuition. She had sold the only valuable thing she owned without a second thought. She remembered Marco's face when she gave him the money, his eyes shining with tears and gratitude. "Mama," he had said, clutching her hand, "I promise you, one day I will buy you 100 rings. I will build you a palace." Now he stood before her, not with a palace, but with an eviction notice. He was taking away the only home she had ever known and sending her away to die among strangers. The irony was a bitter acid in her throat. "Pack a small bag," Marco instructed, his voice pulling her from the memory. "Just the essentials. There isn't much space." He turned to leave, his duty done. He had delivered the news. He had provided the solution. He did not want to linger in the presence of her silent, shattering grief. It was an inconvenience. Elena watched him walk toward the door, her heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. This was her son, the child she had nursed through fevers, the boy whose dreams she had funded with her own sacrifices. And he was casting her aside like a piece of old, unwanted furniture. The love she had felt just moments before was being replaced by a cold, desolate emptiness. The shiny black car did not take her to a clean, state-run facility. Marco drove for nearly an hour, away from the town she knew, deep into the city's forgotten industrial district. The streets grew grimmer, lined with derelict warehouses and grim, gray apartment blocks, stained with rain and neglect. He pulled up in front of one of the worst buildings, a concrete monstrosity with cracked windows and graffiti scarring its walls. "This is it," he announced, not looking at her. Elena stared out the window, confused and frightened. "But you said a home, a care facility." "Plans changed," he muttered, getting out of the car. "This is better. More private." He opened her door and pulled her out onto the crumbling pavement. He retrieved her single, small bag from the trunk, the one containing a few changes of clothes, her photograph of Antonio, and her husband's old threadbare coat. He thrust a small wad of cash into her hand. "This should last you a while," he said. "Don't call me. I'll be in touch when I can." He did not specify when that might be. He led her into a dark, foul-smelling lobby and up 3 flights of stairs. The air was thick with the smell of mold and boiled cabbage. He stopped at a door with peeling paint and unlocked it. He pushed it open and gestured for her to go inside. The apartment was tiny, smaller than her old living room. It consisted of a single room with a lumpy mattress on a metal frame in one corner and a small table with one chair. A tiny, grimy kitchenette was shoved against the far wall. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a weak yellow light. The only window looked out onto a brick wall. The cold from the concrete floor seeped through the thin soles of her slippers. "It's not much, but it's a place to stay," Marco said, his voice echoing in the empty space. He placed her bag on the floor. He did not step fully inside. Elena stood in the middle of the room, clutching her purse, her body trembling. This was not a home. This was a prison cell, a place to be forgotten. "Marco, please," she begged, turning to him, her eyes pleading. "Don't leave me here. Please." For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Shame, perhaps, or a sliver of guilt. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a hard resolve. "I have to go," he said, his voice tight. "I have a meeting." He turned and walked away without another word. Elena rushed to the doorway, watching his back as he descended the stairs. "Marco!" she cried out, her voice breaking. He didn't stop. He didn't look back. A moment later, she heard the front door of the building slam shut, and then the sound of his powerful engine roaring to life before fading into the distance. He was gone. Elena stood in the doorway, listening to the silence. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the drip of a leaky faucet and the distant wail of a siren. She slowly closed the door and slid the bolt across. The sound was final. She was alone, utterly and completely alone. She sank down onto the cold, dusty floor, wrapped her arms around her knees, and let the first sob escape. The tears streamed down her wrinkled cheeks, silent tears of grief, of betrayal, of a heart that had been irrevocably broken by the one person she loved more than life itself. The damp cold of the room enveloped her, a foreshadowing of the days to come. The first few days were a blur of disbelief and sorrow. Elena barely moved from the lumpy mattress. Her cough grew worse, the damp air aggravating the inflammation in her lungs. She had no medicine, only the lukewarm water from the rusty tap. The money Marco had given her was a pittance. She used it sparingly, buying bread and little cheese from a small grim shop down the street. The food was tasteless in her mouth. Hunger was a dull ache, but it was nothing compared to the gnawing pain in her heart. She tried to call him. Every day, she would walk to the payphone at the corner, her fingers trembling as she dialed the number she knew by heart. It was the number to his office. The first few times a secretary answered, her voice crisp and professional. "Mr. Moretti's office." "May I please speak to Marco?" Elena would ask, her voice small. "Who may I say is calling?" "His mother." There would be a pause, then the inevitable reply. "I'm sorry, he's in a meeting. He's unavailable." Then the click of the line going dead. She tried again and again. Each time, the same result. He was always in a meeting, always unavailable. After a week, the secretary's voice grew colder. "Please stop calling this number. Mr. Moretti is not available to you." Finally, one rainy afternoon, she dialed the number and heard a different tone. A recorded voice, sterile and impersonal, informed her, "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." He had disconnected it. He had cut the last, tenuous thread connecting them. Elena let the receiver fall from her hand. It swung back and forth on its metal cord, a pendulum marking the end of all hope. The rain began to fall harder, soaking her thin coat as she stood there, staring at the phone. He had not just abandoned her. He had erased her. The money ran out. The last of the bread was gone. A deep, gnawing hunger set in. It was a physical pain that clouded her thoughts and weakened her limbs. She knew she had to do something. The idea of begging was a profound humiliation, a violation of the pride she had clung to her entire life. But survival was a more primal instinct. She walked for what felt like miles, back toward a part of the city that was more familiar, where there were markets and people. She stood at the edge of a bustling farmer's market, watching the vendors pack up their stalls at the end of the day. She saw a man tossing bruised apples and wilted lettuce into a bin. Summoning all her courage, she approached him. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Could I possibly have some of those vegetables you are throwing away? I am very hungry." The man, tired and irritable after a long day, scowled at her. "Get out of here, old woman," he snapped. "I'm not running a charity. Go on, shoo." He waved his hand at her dismissively, as if she were a stray dog. The public scorn was a fresh wound on top of all the others. Her cheeks burned with shame. She turned and hurried away, her eyes stinging with tears. As she rounded a corner, she nearly bumped into a woman she recognized. It was Maria, her former next-door neighbor, a woman with whom she had shared coffee and conversation over the garden fence for 30 years. "Maria," Elena said, a flicker of hope igniting within her. Maria's eyes widened in recognition, and then, just as quickly, they shifted away. A look of acute discomfort crossed her face. She mumbled a quick, "I'm sorry, I'm in a hurry," and quickly crossed the street, pretending she had not seen her. Elena watched her go, the hope dying as quickly as it had been born. The word had clearly spread. She was the woman whose son had sold her house and thrown her out. She was a pariah. an object of pity and scorn. Her isolation was now complete. That night, back in the cold, dark room, despair settled over her like a shroud. She was sick, starving, and utterly alone. She huddled on the mattress, pulling her husband Antonio's old coat over her thin frame. It was all she had left of him, of her old life. It still carried his faint scent, a mixture of earth, tobacco, and hard work. She buried her face in the worn wool, inhaling the ghost of him, and wept. As her fingers clutched the fabric, she felt something stiff in the lining. A lump. Something she had never noticed before. Her curiosity piqued. She sat up. With fumbling fingers, she felt along the seam inside the coat. There was a small tear. She carefully worked her finger into the opening and pulled out a long, yellowish envelope, brittle with age. She held it up to the weak light from the bare bulb. Her name, Elena, was written on the front in Antonio's familiar, strong handwriting. She didn't remember him ever putting it there. Her hands trembled as she opened the flap. Inside were several folded documents covered in dense legal text, maps, and official-looking stamps. They were old land deeds, geological surveys, and property titles. She vaguely remembered Antonio talking about them years and years ago. He had bought some worthless scrubland out in the valley, land nobody wanted. He had called it his real treasure, his legacy for Marco. He had been so proud. She had dismissed it as one of his foolish dreams. She had forgotten all about it. She couldn't make sense of the complicated language. To her, it was just a pile of old, useless paper. With a sigh of disappointment, she tucked the envelope back into the coat's lining. It was not food. It was not medicine. It was just another memory of a life that was gone forever. The next morning, Elna was awakened by a gentle knock on her door. She was weak from hunger, and her fever was higher than ever. She ignored it, thinking it was a mistake. But the knocking persisted, soft but insistent. Slowly, painfully, she got to her feet and shuffled to the door. She slid the bolt and opened it a crack. A young woman stood there, holding a steaming bowl. She had tired eyes, but a kind face. "Hello," the woman said softly. "I am Sophia. I live in the apartment next to yours. I heard you coughing all night. You sound very sick. I brought you some soup." Elena stared at her, speechless. An act of kindness from a complete stranger. It was so unexpected, it felt like a dream. She opened the door wider. Sophia stepped inside, her eyes taking in the barren room and Elena's frail condition with a look of deep concern. "You poor thing," Sophia whispered. "Come, you must eat." She helped Elena to the lone chair and placed the bowl of hot lentil soup on the table. Elena ate, slowly at first, then with a desperate hunger. The warmth of the soup spread through her body, a small miracle of comfort and life. It was the first act of human compassion she had received in weeks. When she was finished, she looked at Sophia, her eyes filled with tears of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "God bless you." Sophia stayed with her, asking gentle questions. Elena, her defenses worn down by sickness and despair, found herself telling this kind stranger everything. The story tumbled out. Her son, the house, the abandonment. Sophia listened patiently, her expression a mixture of pity and anger. "That is monstrous," Sophia said when Elena had finished. "No child should treat their mother that way." Elena, feeling a desperate need to do something, to hold on to some sliver of hope, remembered the envelope. She retrieved the old coat and pulled out the documents. "My husband left me these," she said, her voice filled with a hopeless resignation. He said they were important, but I think they are just old papers. Sophia took the documents. She was a cleaner, not a lawyer, and the technical language was beyond her. But she could see the official seals, the property markers on the maps. They looked important. I don't know what these are, Sophia admitted, but my cousin works as a cleaner in a law office for a man named Mr. Rossi. They say he is an honest man. Maybe he would look at them for you. It was a fragile, desperate long shot, but it was the only hope Elena had. Do you think he would? She asked, her voice trembling. We can only ask, Sophia said, with a determined look. We have to try. Meanwhile, across the city, in a world of glass and steel, Marco Moretti was on top of the world. He stood in a high-rise boardroom, looking out over the city lights. He was hosting a dinner for his primary investor, his father-in-law, a formidable industrialist named Signore Bianchi. The deal they were celebrating was the culmination of Marco's ambitions, a luxury resort and spa development in the valley just outside the city. It was a project worth hundreds of millions. The preliminary work is complete, Marco said, swirling a glass of expensive red wine. We begin clearing the land next week. This project will make us all very, very wealthy. Signore Bianchi clapped him on the shoulder, a rare sign of approval. You've done well, Marco. I was hesitant at first. Your background, it's not the best, but you have proven yourself to be ruthless. That is a valuable quality in business. Isabella, draped in diamonds, smiled proudly at her husband. She loved the power, the money, the status he was accumulating. It was everything she had ever wanted. Tell me again about your family, Marco, Signore Bianchi said, his eyes sharp. You've always been vague. Marco took a sip of his wine, his expression smooth and practiced. There is not much to tell, he said, with a dismissive wave of his hand. My parents were simple, uneducated people. They lived and died in a small village, passed away years ago. They left me nothing but a desire to escape that life. Everything I have, I built myself, with my own 2 hands. The lie came easily to his lips. He had told it so many times it almost felt true. He had scrubbed the stain of his humble origins from his life story. His mother, the house, the poverty. They were all inconvenient truths he had buried. He had no family. He was a self-made man. The irony was that the very foundation of his grand project rested on the land where his mother's house once stood. That small plot was the linchpin, the access point to the entire development. By selling it, he believed he had secured his future. He had no idea that he had only sold a single page of a book, while his mother, shivering in a cold room miles away, held the entire volume. He celebrated his triumph, blissfully unaware that the ground beneath his feet was about to crumble. A few days later, Sophia accompanied Elena to the office of Mr. Rossi. It was a modest office, but clean and orderly. Mr. Rossi was an older man with kind, weary eyes and a neatly trimmed gray beard. He listened patiently as Sophia explained their situation. He looked at Elena, at her worn clothes and frail state, and his expression softened with sympathy. "Let me see the documents," he said gently. Elena handed him the yellowish envelope. He slid the papers out and spread them across his large wooden desk. He put on a pair of reading glasses and began to study them. At first, he was silent. Then he let out a low whistle. He went to a large cabinet and pulled out a series of detailed regional maps, spreading them next to the deeds. He traced lines with his finger, comparing the old documents to the modern maps. His brow furrowed in concentration. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Elena and Sophia sat in silence, twisting their hands in their laps. Finally, Mr. Rossi looked up. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes, a look of profound astonishment on his face. "Signora," he said, his voice filled with awe. "Do you have any idea what you have here?" Elena shook her head. "My husband said they were his treasure. I thought he was just dreaming." "He was not dreaming," Mr. Rossi said, leaning forward. "He was a visionary. These are the original, uncontested deeds for the entire Northern Valley. Not just the small plot your house was on. All of it. Over 500 acres of it." He paused, letting the information sink in. "But that is not the most important part. I have been following the news of the Moretti Development Project. Their geological surveys recently discovered something. Something they thought was on land they controlled." He pointed to a spot on the survey map from Elena's envelope. "Your husband's survey from 40 years ago found it first. A geothermal spring, a massive underground reservoir of hot, mineral-rich water." He looked directly at Elena, his eyes wide. "Signora Moretti, that spring makes this land one of the most valuable parcels in the entire country. The development your son is planning is impossible without your land. In fact, you don't just own the access point. You own the entire prize. Based on this, you are not a poor woman. You are, without exaggeration, a multi-millionaire." Elena stared at him, her mind unable to process the words. Millionaire? Her? It was impossible. She was a woman who had been grateful for a bowl of soup just days before. She looked at her cracked, empty hands. How could they belong to a rich woman? Sophia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked from the lawyer to Elena, her eyes shining with tears of joy for her friend. What does this mean?" Elena whispered. "It means," said Mr. Rossi, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across his face, "that everything is about to change. Your son sold a house that he did not have the full right to sell. And in doing so, he has started a war he cannot possibly win." The first legal notice from Mr. Rossi's office hit Marco's company like a lightning bolt. It was a cease and desist order, citing prior ownership of the entire valley and all its mineral rights. Marco initially laughed it off. He assumed it was a clerical error, some distant, unknown relative trying to make a frivolous claim. Crush them, he told his legal team. Bury them in paperwork until they go away. But they didn't go away. Mr. Rossi's office responded with irrefutable proof. The original deeds, authenticated and registered decades before Marco was even born. The name on the deeds was Antonio Moretti, with all rights passing to his surviving spouse, Elena Moretti. Marco's blood ran cold when he read his mother's name. It couldn't be. It was impossible. She had nothing. He had made sure of that. He remembered her as a frail, defeated old woman in a cold room. How could she be behind this? The news spread like wildfire through the investment community. Marco's project was built on a foundation of sand. The land he claimed to control was not his. His investors, led by the formidable Signore Bianchi, called an emergency meeting. Marco stood before them, sweating in his expensive suit. He tried to bluff, to reassure them. "It is a misunderstanding," he insisted. "A legal tactic from a disgruntled family member. My mother is an old, confused woman. She is being manipulated. I will handle it." Signore Bianchi was not convinced. He had done his own research. He stared at Marco with eyes as cold as ice. "You told me your parents were dead," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. You told me you were self-made. You lied to me. You built this entire enterprise on a lie, and you have exposed my capital to enormous risk. I can fix this, Marco pleaded. Just give me some time. Time is something you do not have, Signore Bianchi declared. My consortium is pulling all funding, effective immediately. We are suing you for fraud and misrepresentation. You are finished, Moretti? The collapse was swift and brutal. Within 48 hours, Marco's company was bankrupt. His accounts were frozen. The bank foreclosed on his lavish home. The shiny black car was repossessed. He lost everything. He returned to his now empty mansion to find Isabella packing her suitcases into a taxi. Her face was a mask of cold fury. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice hollow. "I am going back to my father," she said, not looking at him. "I married a successful man, Marco, not a failure, not the son of some poor old woman who just bankrupted us. You are a liar and a fool. I never want to see you again." She got into the taxi without a backward glance and was gone. Marco was left standing on the curb, watching the life he had so carefully constructed drive away. He had nothing. No money, no company, no wife, no home. He was ruined. And it was all because of her, his mother, the woman he had left to rot. In his desperation, a single toxic thought took root. She had done this to him. But a second, more practical thought followed. She was now his only hope. She had the one thing that could save him, the land. He had to find her. He had to get her to sign it over to him. With the help of Mr. Rossi, Elena's first act as a wealthy woman was to buy back her home. The developer who had purchased it from Marco was happy to sell, eager to distance himself from the legal mess. Elena stepped back through her front door, the air no longer smelling of decay, but of fresh paint and new beginnings. The house was being meticulously restored, but she had insisted they keep the old fireplace, the worn floorboards, the crack in the ceiling shaped like a bird. She didn't want a palace. She just wanted her home back. She also established a foundation, a charity to help elderly people and single mothers who had fallen on hard times. She appointed Sophia, her first and truest friend, as its director. Sophia's life was transformed, but her kindness remained unchanged. One crisp afternoon, Elena was sitting on her newly repaired porch, wrapped in a warm cashmere shawl, a gift from Sophia. She was sipping a cup of hot tea, looking out over the valley, her valley. The land was green and peaceful. She felt a sense of quiet contentment she hadn't known in years. A man came walking up the gravel road. He was thin and disheveled, his clothes rumpled and dirty. He walked with a slump, his face etched with exhaustion and despair. It took her a moment to recognize him. It was Marco. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps, staring up at her. He saw the restored house, her warm shawl, the look of calm dignity on her face. He saw everything he had lost, everything he had thrown away. His face crumpled. He fell to his knees on the gravel, the sharp stones digging into his trousers. "Mama," he sobbed, the word torn from him. "Mama, I'm so sorry." Elena looked down at him, her heart a tangled knot of old love and new pain. She did not speak. She simply waited. "They took everything," he cried, his words choked with self-pity. "The house, the company. Isabella left me. I have nothing. I'm living in a shelter. Mama, you have to help me. Please. It was all a mistake. I was a fool. I love you. If you just sign the papers, give me back the land. We can fix this. We can be a family again." His apology was all about him, his loss, his pain, his needs. He wasn't sorry for what he had done to her. He was sorry for what had happened to him. The realization settled in Elena's heart, not with anger, but with a deep, profound sadness. The son she had loved was truly gone, replaced by this desperate, selfish stranger. She stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking down at him. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud or hateful. It was quiet, calm, and unbreakable. I remember the nights I stayed up until dawn, my fingers bleeding from the needle, sewing dresses for rich women so you could have new books for school, she began, her voice steady. I remember the day I sold my wedding ring, the only piece of your father I had left, so you could go to the university. You promised me a palace, Marco. Do you remember that? He looked up, his face streaked with tears and dirt. He could only nod, unable to speak. I remember the cold, she continued, her gaze distant, as if seeing the damp, gray room again. I remember the hunger. I remember calling you, day after day, and you would not answer. I remember a man telling me to shoo like a dog when I asked for scraps of food. I remember my neighbors turning away from me in the street, their faces full of pity and shame. You did not just take my house, Marco. You took my dignity. You tried to erase my life. She looked him in the eye. This land was never yours to sell. It was your father's legacy, a legacy of love and hope for his family. You tried to sell it for greed. The house you sold was just wood and stone. The home you destroyed, that was in my heart, and you have shattered it. A single tear traced a path down her wrinkled cheek. A mother's heart is a strange thing. It has no choice but to forgive. So yes, my son, in the quiet of my soul, I forgive you. But forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. She took a step back from the edge of the porch. I cannot let you back into my life. I cannot give you this land. It is not for you to waste on foolish dreams of power. It will be used to help people who, like me, have been left with nothing. People who understand the value of a bowl of soup, of a kind word. Her final words were soft, but they carried the weight of a life's worth of pain and newfound strength. You told me you built your life with your own two hands. Now you must do it for real. Go, Marco, and build a life worthy of your father's memory. That is the only way you will ever find peace. She turned then, without another word, and walked into her house. She closed the door softly behind her. The click of the latch was the sound of a final, irrevocable ending. Marco remained on his knees for a long time, the cold of the gravel seeping into his bones. He was alone, outside the warm house, outside the life he had destroyed. He finally pushed himself to his feet and walked away, a solitary figure disappearing down the long road. Months later, the valley was thriving. The Elena Moretti Foundation had built a new community center and a shelter for families in crisis. The geothermal spring was being used to provide clean, inexpensive energy to the entire region. Elena's house was filled not with loneliness, but with the laughter of Sophia's children and the gentle bustle of friends. She sat on her porch, watching the sun set behind the hills. She was at peace. She was alone, but she was not lonely. She had her home, her dignity, and a purpose that filled her days. She had survived. Far away, in another city, Marco lifted another heavy sack of cement onto his shoulder. His hands were calloused and raw. His back ached with a constant dull pain. He worked from sunrise to sunset, a nameless face on a construction crew, building luxury apartments for men like he used to be. He was paying his debt, one day of hard labor at a time. He had learned the value of his own two hands, but it was a lesson that had cost him everything. Because a mother's love is a foundation, not a commodity to be sold. When you crack that foundation, the entire house you built for yourself will inevitably come crashing down. And life, sooner or later, always collects what it is owed.